Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the CFP in the very first year, gave a grade for it. I'm going to go with the C+. I do think it was a very successful year. I think it did what it was supposed to do, and I think it gave us a lot of great things. There are some kinks to figure out, and I think it could be an A+ product in a couple of years once we figure out those kinks. Have to assume there's going to be more teams in that thing, but we'll figure it out when time comes, and definitely some things that we'll talk about. Probably next week I'll get into what I would do with the playoff, what I would do with conference real, a lot of different things I'll talk about next week kind of in the future of this sport. But how long will the Big Ten reign last is something that I want to talk about here for a second, because it's been established at this point that the Big Ten has passed the SEC. They are the top conference in the country. They are back in the. They could have back-to-back national champions. The SEC has been sitting on the sideline the last 2 years for that game. So it's been pretty clear. The Big Ten has jumped the SEC. The question now becomes, how far have they jumped the SEC, and how long will it last for them being above the SEC and not, will it bounce back and forth? Will it be the Big Ten just kind of carrying the weight for a very long time? And I think there's a good argument both ways, if I'm being totally honest. I really do think the Big Ten is set up for a lot of success in the NIL era, in the era just coming forward for the next couple of years. And the SEC has plenty of arguments as well, that they will bounce right back and be able to play what the advantages that the Big Ten was able to take advantage of. Same thing the SEC will try to do over the next 5 years or so. But let's first get into why the Big Ten can stay on top, the reasons the Big Ten could stay on top, and I think this is one that gets a little bit overlooked, but the big city appeal in the NIL era is a big deal. There's no doubt about that. You have a lot of schools that are very, very close to the city of Chicago up there in the Big Ten, a couple of schools very close to Indianapolis, a couple of schools close to New York City. When you talk about Rutgers and Maryland and a couple other schools like that, Maryland next to Baltimore. So you do have a lot of people that say, the NIL era is all about, where you are. It's all about the connections that you have and the ability that you have to kind of garner those connections. That happens in big-time cities. That's the reality. There's no doubt about that. Anthony, I'm only seeing one of your comments here, but I will address for this one real quick. I don't think it'll last as long as people think. I think the SEC is having a down year, and I think they're going to be at the top of the conference. I totally understand that take, and I'll actually get into a big reason I tend to believe that you might just be right, Anthony, here in a second. But for the NIL era, I just think being around big cities is a huge part of that. Now, you do have Atlanta, Nashville, Austin very much in SEC country. So it's not to say the SEC can't take advantage of this. It's not to say the ACC couldn't take advantage with Atlanta being in there and a couple of Miami being in there and a couple others. But it feels like the Big Ten has the most ability to tap into what these big cities have to offer up in the north and take advantage of those for NIL opportunities. I don't know if the gap is absolutely massive, but I do think it's noticeable, and it has been told that a lot of recruits that are looking at different schools are looking at those Big Ten schools because you might have a little bit more proximity to a couple of the nightlife and NIL things that you'd love to have in a big city that you might not have as much in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But another reason they will is you have bright futures for pretty much every contender in this conference. So Ohio State, obviously on the cusp of a title, and they're Ohio State. They always have a bright future. I'm not going to worry about Ohio State. Penn State is looking great for 2025, and I think beyond. I really do love what Ethan Gronkmeyer can bring to that team, and I really think they're going to be incredible teams to watch. And Anthony, here's the other a couple of questions, but for the playoff, I think what should have happened is ASU I don't care that ASU and Boise State won the conference. They shouldn't have gotten the bye, and that I fully agree with that statement, if I'm being totally honest. I don't think auto buys are a good idea, and I do think Texas and Penn State should have gotten those Final Four spots. What I will say is I do think we should reward those teams, so maybe you give Boise State and Arizona State a home game, but not a bye, and that's something we can iron out, definitely something that I'll talk about next week when I get into my official plans for the CFP going forward. But as in terms of the contenders in the Big Ten and what they look like going forward, you obviously, Penn State looking great in 2020. And I think beyond, they're going to be more than fine. Oregon with Dan Lanning feels like they continue to roll in the right direction, a little bit slower than they might want, but still rolling in the right direction. And then Michigan with Bryce Underwood obviously is going to be a huge part of this, definitely a guy that can elevate that program in a lot of different ways. And then you have Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska, which is a huge one to watch over the next couple of years. If they elevate, the Big Ten might be able to stay on top for a very, very long time. But then you do have Wisconsin and a couple other teams that very well could elevate elevate a little bit more and help out that bottom half of the Big Ten that has been a little bit lacking comparative to the SEC in the past couple of years. But then the SEC has plenty as well. There's no doubt about that. UGA and Bama just waning just a little bit has opened this door, and I definitely do think there's a little bit more of a bright future with the top contenders in the Big Ten than they are in the SEC, but it's a really tight margin if I'm being totally honest, and you'll find with this, it's going to be a tight margin for a very long time in this argument. But then you got expansion argument here, and it's for the Big Ten, the biggest thing is you're going to be the front of the line for expansion opportunities. Now, I don't necessarily think that's going to happen. I don't necessarily, especially this offseason, I don't expect a lot of movement. I think the Mountain West and the MAC could get involved and get a couple of teams here and there. I don't see the Big Ten or the SEC getting involved very much this offseason. I think it'll be more about the Big Ten and the SEC fighting the ACC and the Big 12 more than anything else. But I do think there will be a little bit of fighting, but when you look into the future, Big Ten will be the first choice for a team like UNC, for a team like Miami, for just about every team because they are the number one in money. There's no doubt about that, and they're definitely a team or a conference that will have their pick of the litter in a lot of different ways. Now, they do have the academic requirements that make it a little bit tougher, have to be an AAU school if you want to be in the Big Ten, but if they were able to just malign that just a little bit, change that just a little bit, I do think there would be a conversation to be had, and I think they could become a power conference that would be nearly impossible to stop. But Anthony has a one here. I think a Cinderella season for Indiana, or I think this was a Cinderella season for Indiana. I think they go back to being 8. I fully understand that, and that's something that definitely is something to watch, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Definitely something I want to get into because they look like a good team going into 2025, but a lot of different questions, no doubt about that. And then, yeah, absolutely. I fully agree that the Big Ten, I think Miami, I think Clemson is a much better fit in the SEC as well as Florida State. I think when you look at the Big Ten, probably North Carolina, Virginia, those type of teams feel like better fits, but definitely is a world where the Big Ten is going to get all of the teams that want to be in a new conference are going to look at the Big Ten first in a lot of different ways. But then we got to get to the SEC, and while they'll bounce back, and we'll get to that question about 2025 here in a second, Anthony, but elite fan buy-in is a huge part of this because in the NIL world, you need people that are just coming to your games to donate just that little bit more, to go to the NIL fund, to go to the collective to help this team get a little bit better. So that's kind of the biggest thing here is these SEC teams are not used to being bad. That's just the reality. Auburn has a title in this century. Florida has been remarkable in this past century, and even it feels like they're turning a corner just about right now. And then you do have Georgia, you do have Bama, Texas, Oklahoma. All of these teams are very used to success. They're very used to winning 9 games, winning 10 games, getting into the national conversation, and they don't really accept anything less. So you look at Auburn right now. Auburn has Hugh Freeze, and it feels like things are sort of moving in the right direction. Did a great job in the portal, did a great job all over the place. If they don't win next year, he will be fired, and they will go out and get the biggest guy that they can possibly get. They will attack that thing the same exact way they attacked the Hugh Freeze hire, and they will continue to do that until they get it right. I think that is a small difference between the SEC and the Big Ten is I don't think the SEC is going to rest until they are back on top of this sport. I don't think these fans are going to rest. I don't think the administration or these teams are really going to rest because the reality is these fans are just so insane. I lived in SEC country. I went to an SEC school. I am telling you, these fans will not accept anything but being the top team in the country, but being one of the top programs in the country, and I do think that will play a little bit of a part. It's not to say that Big Ten fans are bad or Big Ten fans aren't bought in as much, but it is to say that I think these schools down in the SEC are getting a little bit mad right about now, and I think these fans are getting a little bit mad, and I think they're going to take over just a little bit over the next little bit and be very, very mad. A lot of money will be going into the NIL funds for all these SEC schools. And the Billy Napier conversation is one that I'm watching with a fine-tooth comb. I'm very interested in what that holds. Now, let's talk about the 2025 season because that does have something to do with Billy Napier because that's a big thing here is I think the SEC has elite quarterback play coming in 2025 and beyond 2025. I think they will have the best quarterbacks in the country, and you tend to find that the best quarterbacks in the country find their way to being the best teams in the country. Now, there are questions, no doubt about that, and you look at the Big Ten, you do have Bryce Underwood, you do have Julian Sayin, you do have a guy like Aiden Childs that I think could elevate over the next couple of years. So there's a lot of different things that are going on in the Big Ten that there's great quarterback play there. It's a little bit different in the SEC in 2025 and going forward. DJ Lagway, Nico Iamaleava, Arch Manning, Lenoris Sellers, Keelan Russell is a guy at Alabama that, frankly, I think he's going to be the starter for them in 2025, but that's someone we have time to talk about, I promise. But Deuce Knight is a guy coming up in the Auburn ranks. I just think the quarterback play at the SEC is going to be ridiculous over the next 2, 3, 4 years, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere. And I think when you look at the world of college football, you got the quarterback, you got a lot of things heading in the right direction. So that's a huge reason for me, and Anthony, it's a huge reason why the SEC might just bounce right back on top. You know, Texas could be the dominant team in the country next year, and we'll talk about Texas likely on Friday because a lot of guys going out the door, and it will define what 2025 looks like. But overall, really, really elite quarterback play coming in the next couple of years in the SEC, and I really do think that will tip the scales just a little bit towards the SEC in this one. And then the recruiting footprint advantage is just the reality. I think we all understand this at this point. The SEC has the most the most states to pull from with the best talent. You know, you have Florida, you have Georgia, you have Texas, Louisiana, you have all of the big-time states. California is one that's a little bit far away, but they've done a great job kind of tapping into that. They have the most guys right near them. And obviously, it is a national recruiting. You know, the world of recruiting has entirely changed. It's not necessarily you have to be connected by area to be recruited by that team. Lots of Georgia guys, lots of Florida guys going to Texas, lots of Ohio State guys come from Georgia and Florida and all of those different places. So it's not to say the Big Ten can't tap into that, but it does give the SEC a little bit of a leg up. It does give the SEC ability to build these teams from the ground up a little bit stronger, a little bit faster, a little bit more able than the Big Ten will be able to do over the next couple of years. And obviously the NIL and portal era changes that just a little bit, but the recruiting advantage is still very much there. And overall, my final take around all of this is I think it's going to bounce back and forth. I'm kind of with Anthony here in some sense. I don't know what 2025 looks like because I love what Oregon, I love what Penn State, Ohio State are doing. But at the end of the day, I think when you look at what the SEC brings, they're not going to be down for long. These fans will not allow it. These administrations will not allow it. And these coaches will not allow it. And I really think the talent level will continue to rise in the SEC. I think that quarterback play will make a huge push. But overall, you know, the SEC dominance was not a mirage. That's something that I've seen on Twitter a little bit, that the SEC, we were just lying to people that the SEC was the best conference in the country. It was for about 15 years. Now, the big difference is Nick Saban's not in the SEC anymore, and that is a huge piece of this. Let's just be totally honest. The SEC for a long time was Alabama, Georgia, and about nobody else, at least on the national scale. But the reality is he is out of the sport. I still think there's a number of things that will push the SEC to find their way back to the top, and maybe it's 2025, maybe it's 2026, but I don't think any conference is going to stay on top of this sport for very long. I think it's going to bounce back and forth between these two entities for quite some time, and it'll make for some great Twitter arguments for which one is actually the better conference in some time. But definitely a very odd debate, and definitely one that is really hard to get a full beat on. You know, you never really know what the NIL and what the transfer portal era will hold. You never know if the Big Ten's going to go out and get Miami tomorrow. You never know what's going to happen in this sport. But overall, I do think it's going to bounce back and forth in a number of different ways. And you're totally right about Arch Manning. You know, he looks like a great player. Every time you've seen him, it looks absolutely incredible. There's a lot of pressure on that kid, and it will be very interesting to see what he looks like in 2025. I think he'll be a great player. I don't know if he'll live up to the hype that everyone has for him, because I don't know if anyone really can live up to the hype that everyone has for him. But at the end of the day, it will be really interesting to watch all of this unfold. And And Anthony, yeah, I do think there is an argument to be made that the Big Ten might have a bigger scope. You know, getting those California teams did open up a lot of doors in the Pacific Northwest and just the Pacific Coast in a lot of ways. So it'll be interesting to see the effect that has. But as of right now, I think it's fair to say the talent pool, at least from a high school level, in the SEC is just a little bit better than what the Big Ten will have at their disposal. But let's take our second break here. This is obviously something we will talk about in more depth and time, but let's take our second break here. And when we come back, let's do a little bit of a a coaching carousel wrap up. And I say wrap up very questionably, but let's do a little bit of a wrap up, go to all the big time hires that have happened throughout this cycle, and we'll talk about a couple of people that are still guys to watch in this coaching carousel right after this, so stick with us.